with me as we continue our worship this morning? Father in heaven, thank you for that song, for the message of that song. And we ask that your Spirit will continue to lead us and guide us through this day as we open your word and as we think about this journey that you've called us to be on. We ask in your name. Amen. We just want to add my welcome to everyone. Glad you're here today. And we're going to continue our series today that we started last week that's called EQ greater than IQ. So many people, in the business world have recognized that one of the greatest predictors to your success is not your IQ. Anyone thankful for that? Any clapping, spontaneous celebration? But a greater factor is your EQ, your emotional intelligence, the way that we connect with others, the way that we listen or don't listen, the way that we have appropriate boundaries, and the way that we can have conversations with those around us. So if this is true in the business world, if it's true, period, then it must be true from Scripture. Things that are true have a biblical root in them. And so the foundation of our life as disciples is really demonstrating that life that Jesus has demonstrated to us. And last week we started out and we looked at the main idea of the series, which is that you cannot become spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. There's a picture there. But anything that you experience in your life, you hear it, you see it, you taste it, you touch it, it enters into your brain. And in order to get to the part of your brain that thinks, it has to go through the part of your brain that feels. So it's very important for us to pay attention to our emotions, to our feelings, and the way that affects the way that we treat others, the way that we enter our relationship with God as well. And so last week we looked at the principle of looking deeper in your life and the illustration of an iceberg. I can go to handheld if needed, it's no problem. We just got a new mic, so let me know. Either way is fine. You want to do that?
That sounds good right now.
Okay.
You sound good.
It's on, okay.
Yeah, you good.
Sure. So we looked last week in our own life, an iceberg, 90% of it's underwater. And the majority of our life is not what you see in me or I see in you in the words, but there's deeper things going on. And we want to pay attention to those. And as Christians, you can face those things with confidence because Jesus knows everything that's beneath the surface, and He still likes you. He still appreciates you, and He still wants to change those things. And so we don't have to minimize those, but we can be who we truly are because of the gospel, because of Christ. And so today we're going to talk about the gift of limits. I put a picture up here. That is very important limits in that picture, right? I don't know how many of you have gone diving with a saltwater crocodile. I never have, and I never will. But when you think about limits in your life, limits are what truly bring you freedom. The right kind of limits in the right way. And so our culture tells us that if you just take on more, you can be more, you can have more. But real freedom comes by embracing limits, embracing the right kinds of limitations in your life. And Jesus is the one that's demonstrated this to us first and foremost. So if you have a copy of the Scripture, I invite you to open up. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 4. And we also have a stack of Bibles to share. If you don't have one, take one home out here in the lobby on your way in. And in our sharing versions, this is going to be on page 903. Matthew chapter 4. So Jesus in His life demonstrated the power of limits. And that was most of His life since He was born, right? He entered into the world through an unknown family with no prestige. He was essentially born in a cave, not the stable that you see in the pictures at Christmas, but it was more of a cave, into a town that's very little known, very unknown. He was a refugee at a time in his life. His parents, he demonstrated taking on insignificance, taking on limits. He spent 30 years in his dad's shop working for his dad. No miracles, no healings, just learning the trade of carpentry, learning those skills, learning that discipline, preparing for a 3-year ministry. And it says here in Matthew chapter 4, after the high point of the start of his ministry, after the baptism, where he heard God's voice come down and say, "This is my son in whom I am well pleased," then immediately he was led out into a time of testing. And it says here, starting in verse 1, "Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil." You know, sometimes the enemy leads you into a time of difficulty in your life, and it's of his doing. It's of God's doing. It says that he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. And so, to face those things with courage. Verse 2, it says, "After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, 'If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread.' And Jesus answered him, 'It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God.'" And so here's Jesus. He's led into a time of tempting, and the enemy comes to him at his lowest point, when he's hungry, when he's tired, and he tempts him by helping him focus on immediate needs. And it's interesting that if you look at the life of Jesus, he is not there to meet the need of every single person he came into contact with, right? He did not heal each and every person. He prayed all night, but he only chose 12. And at the end of his life, he prays in John chapter 17, verse 4, and he says, "I have completed the work that you gave me to do," talking to his Father. How could he say that? Because if you look in Jerusalem, if you look in Asia and Africa, in the Americas, he didn't even go to most of those places. Every need was not met when Jesus passed away. And yet he says, "I have completed the work that you gave me to do." So it suggests to us something important, and that is that we have to embrace the limit of meeting immediate needs all the time and in every way. This is something that's very difficult, and I have a story that I want to share to help illustrate this. There's a story told of a young man who's on a journey to his purpose in life. He knows what his purpose is. He's on the way, on that journey. And he comes to a bridge that he crosses. And on that bridge, he sees another man, a stranger, coming in the opposite direction. And that stranger who's coming in the opposite direction on that bridge has a rope tied around his waist several times, about 30 feet long. And when they make eye contact, this young man, the stranger says to the young man, can you give me a hand? And he takes that rope off and says, "Here, I want you to just hang on to this rope for a second. I just need a hand." And so the young man says, "Sure, no problem." The stranger then walks to the edge of the bridge and he jumps off. And so the man's hanging on, holding him there for his life. And the stranger says, "It won't be long. Don't let go. Because if you let go, I die." "Okay, I won't, this young man says. But after a while, his grip starts to loosen up. He's running out of energy, so he thinks of options. Option number one, he could tie it off somewhere on the bridge. But he can't find anywhere to tie this rope onto this bridge. This man's dangling. "Don't forget about me. I am your responsibility. You can't let go. Because if you let go, I die." And so he thinks, if I can't find anything to tie it to, then maybe I can tie a rope around my own waist and I can kind of counterbalance it, right? Desmond Doss style. Kind of wrap it around here. So he tries to wrap it around, but it's still quite heavy. And the man says, "No matter what, I am counting on you. I am your responsibility. You can't let go. Because if you let go, I die." And finally, this young man, he's in a dilemma, right? He's really conflicted. Because on the one hand, he wants to help. And if he lets go, the man's going to die. He's going to feel guilty the rest of his life that other person died. But if he continues to hang on, he's going to miss his purpose. Remember, he's on a journey. He's going somewhere to his purpose. And so what's he to do? And finally, this young man says to the stranger, he says, "I refuse to accept the decision for your life. I will pull, but you have to pull also. And when you pull, you can wrap that rope around your waist each time. And gradually, you'll get higher and higher and higher till you get back to the top." And when the stranger hears that, he shrieks. He is like, "What are you saying? This is not fair. No one's ever done this to me. I am your responsibility. Can't you see me here? I'm helpless." And finally, this young man, he has to say on top of the bridge, he says, it hurts me for this to happen, but I accept your choice. And he lets go of that rope. And that young man goes down, the stranger goes off the edge of that bridge. It's a sober story, but it very powerfully illustrates that in your life and in my life, we have to embrace the gift of limits, right? We cannot be responsible for the need of every person all the time that we come into contact with. And so it takes discernment to know when to help, when not to help, and how to help. And Jesus demonstrated this in his life as well, as we looked at. So, what's your rope in your life? Right? Is it someone that says to you, if you don't help me, if there's not money, if there's not time, then I could do something really dangerous? Maybe your rope is saying no to the way you spend your time. Maybe your rope is going to bed a little earlier, or having a little more financial discipline. But your freedom comes not by going after everything with endless restrictions, but embracing the right kinds of restrictions, the ones that are true to our nature. And so this is the first thing that Jesus demonstrates in the gift of limits, and that is to embrace limitations, embrace the right kind of restrictions that are true to our nature. There's a second thing that he demonstrates as we read along in the passage. And if you just joined us, we're in Matthew chapter 4. And we're resuming back in verse 5. It says, Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. If you are the Son of God, he said, throw yourself down. For it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against the stone. And this second area that Jesus demonstrates is accepting the limit of personal greatness. Accepting the limit of personal greatness. And he demonstrated this throughout his life. When they wanted to make Jesus king, what did he do? He slipped away. He ran away in the other direction. When the disciples were arguing about who's the greatest and who's going to get a cabinet position, right? In the Jesus administration at the Last Supper, he says, no, you got it all wrong. And he gets down on his knees, he takes a towel, and he serves them. There's a quote that illustrates this by Peter Casero, and he says, emotionally healthy people understand the limits God has given them. They joyfully receive the 1, 2, 7, or 10 talents God has so graciously distributed. As a result, they are not frenzied and covetous, trying to live a life God never intended. Their lives are marked by what? Contentment and joy. So if you see someone who's living under constant frustration and discouragement or envy or jealousy or anger, they haven't embraced the gift of limits. And to embrace the gift of limits and personal greatness is to say, I want to be who God created me to be. I don't want to be someone else. Because at the end of your life, God's not going to ask you, did you measure up? Were you like that other person? He's going to ask you, were you the person that I created you to be? And so that humility is embracing your position in life. And it's embracing and saying, you know, there might be other people around me that have 8 or 10 talents, but I got 2. And I'm comfortable with that, and I'm going to use those 2 talents to the best of my ability for the glory of God. That's freedom. That's freedom. It's not the endless pursuit of more, but it's accepting restrictions that are true to your gifting, your personality, and to your capacity and to the way that you're wired. And so, when Jesus was tempted to turn the stones into bread, he rejected that. He embraced the gift of limits, and the rocks stayed rocks. When he was tempted to jump off the temple to perform a miracle as a shortcut, he accepted those limits, and he walked down off that temple. You know, just staying on this second area here of personal greatness, one of the things that impacts me and impresses me so much is people that look at their stage in life, their season in life, and make sacrifices in order to help others, even though they could personally advance if they didn't. And so a parent that doesn't maybe pursue certain career moves in order to provide for their kids. I think in our own church here, Reuben and Debbie Amaro, many of you know them, just this last week, they went to Puerto Rico to bring back Debbie's mom here. And that's going to be a major sacrifice to her and her career, her time. But they're doing it because it's not about their comfort and about their greatness. It's about serving others. And in whatever season of life we're in, there's those choices that we have to make. Are we going to live for our own greatness? Are we going to accept the way God created us and not be focused on the progress of those things? So Jesus demonstrates this through the temptation to turn stones into bread. Also to perform a miracle and jump off the temple. And each time he does that with the Word of God, right? There's a third and final limit that Jesus embraces, and that has to deal with suffering and pain. Matthew chapter 4, reading along in verse 8. It says, "Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in their splendor. 'All this I will give you,' he said, 'if you would just bow down and worship me.'" And I can picture him standing there and the enemy showing him, "Look at all the splendor around you. Look at the greatness of Jerusalem. Look at the riches of Rome. Look at the brilliance of Athens and all the treasures of Egypt, the then known world. If you will just short circuit going to the cross and suffering and just bow down to me now, then you can accomplish your purpose," right? That's always one of the lies, that you can go around anything difficult to come out at the right conclusion. And what does Jesus say? He says here in verse 10, he says, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him, and the angels came and attended him. Jesus' decision was not to short circuit the desert and the wilderness and the cross. Before he could have the crown, he first had to have the cross. And before we can experience resurrection and joy and fullness, we have to enter into a time of challenge and a time of testing. And those things, even though we push back against them, are often engineered by God himself. But they're for our good, so that we might grow, that we might come closer to God and embrace that limit of whatever that suffering or whatever that challenge is. Just this week, for those of you that may not be aware, but we had a funeral in this church. And the Vitorillo family, Mark and Sharon Vitorillo, are here today, along with their family. This past Friday, Mark's mother passed away in their house here just down the road. And you know, when someone is coming to the end of their life, typically there is health conditions, there are challenges, and there's a time for transition in a hospital or whatever that might look like. But when that happens instantaneous, there's no transition time. And it is a total catastrophe, crisis. And they're here today, and I want to ask you to lift them up in prayer, encouragement. I was so impressed with how Mark stood up and gave a word of respect and remembrance to his mom and what that meant. And a handful of you were there at that funeral. But every time we have a funeral like that, you can't explain why it happens. If you could explain why it happens, it would be evil. Evil's irrational. The best thing we can do is come close to people and just be there, just be around. But what it does remind us is that before we experience resurrection, we first have to die, right? Before you can experience the crown, you first have to go to the cross. And Jesus rejected that desire to avoid anything. And remember, he is God himself, who came down and took on the limits of a baby. He took on the limits of a young boy growing up. He took upon the limits of human nature. And at any time, he could have used his power and his authority. But he chose not to. And when he went to the cross, he experienced the greatest restriction that any man or any woman can ever experience. The restriction not only of physical, but emotionally, because he did not expect that he would raise from the dead. And you say, how could that be? Because Jesus is God. He knows the prophecies. He knows what's going to happen in the future. But that experience of that restriction, that experience of that limitation was so painful that in his own existential sense of feeling, he could not see the dawn of that next day. And yet, because of that greatest restriction, it brought about the greatest power in our life. The greatest accomplishment in the history of the world came from the greatest limitation, the greatest restriction. You know, someone said that Jesus didn't just take our place, he gave us his place. And because of his death, you and I can live with freedom right now. We can be who we really are with nothing to hide. We can serve others with a deeper purpose that's eternal, not just temporal. And we have the hope of resurrection one day. Because I know there's a family here this morning that's looking forward to that day when they see Edith come out of the ground. And I know that you have lost people close to you as well, and you're looking forward to that day. And the only way that happens is because of that great pain, that great restriction, that great limitation. And so when you take on limitations, don't ever think the world's coming to an end, right? Jesus took on the greatest limitation. We feel it's challenging, but we're going to experience that freedom by embracing restrictions, by embracing limitations, the right ones, the ones that are true to God's nature and true to the Word of God. I want to invite Christy Negretti to come up here to the front, because we don't want to be simply sharing the message of this. We want to give practical application to it. And one of the limitations that is important to all of our life is the limitation of good financial stewardship. And particularly as a church community, as we talk about giving and we talk about supporting mission, it's hard to do those things if we're living in deep debt, right? And this is something that crosses economic lines, it crosses all lines. But we want to talk about something very important coming up. I have a slide here in the background. But Christy, could you take a few moments and share with us your story about financial stewardship limitations in your own life as we look at what's going to happen here this year? Thank you.
Forgive me if I'm a little nervous. I'm not used to sharing my personal details of my life in front of a group of people. But I asked Anthony if I could share because this is something that's very important to me, very important to my husband and I. Typically, every couple is going to go through some kind of financial crisis in their life, and for my husband and I, it happened several years ago. We ended up in court for something that was supposed to be quick and easy, about $5,000. It was supposed to be over in about 60 days. Well, that 60 days stretched out to a year. And by the time the year was over, we won our court case, but we were in financial ruins. We had cleared out every single bank account we had, every savings account we had. We pulled money out of both of our 401ks. We borrowed money from family. Everything we could do to keep our legal representation so we could actually win our court battle. And by the time we were done, we had nothing. We were behind on every single bill we had. We were ignoring the phone because 9 times out of 10 it was a debt collector. We weren't opening the mail because I was sick and tired of looking at collection notices. And it was incredibly depressing. Very depressing way to live. And finally one day, we were going over to my mother-in-law's and I couldn't take it anymore. So I grabbed my laptop, I went online and I found a debt snowball spreadsheet, and I grabbed all that mail that we hadn't opened, and I brought it with us. My husband was helping my mother-in-law with her computer. And I sat at her counter and I started opening the mail. And by the time I was done, I had a list of 38 creditors that we owed money to. And I had a total amount of debt that was 6 figures long, and that did not include our mortgage. So, after my heart attack, I showed my husband, and we sat down and we did two things. We rededicated our income to God, and we went online for help. There's a point in time where you have to realize that you need help. And I was so embarrassed that I was looking for help, because here I was, I had a business degree. I worked in finance. I was the church treasurer, and our finances were in ruins. And they entrusted the church finances to me. And I felt like I couldn't share with anyone that we needed help. So we went online, and we found FPU. And Financial Peace University is a biblically based program. Now, people who don't want to talk about finances in church, I'm sorry, but you're wrong. The one thing that Jesus talked about all the time in the New Testament is money. He talked about money. Money is important. It is important for us to have control of what God has entrusted to us. And if you read the book of Proverbs, you can get a whole finance lesson there too. So we found a class nearby that was at a church a town over, and we started going. I think it was the following week. We bought our materials and we went. And we started going. And we started following the biblical principles that this program has. And true freedom really does come from embracing limits, because when you start, people don't want to do a budget because it's limiting, it's restrictive, but it's actually truly freeing to be able to sit down and tell your money where to go. True freedom comes from getting rid of that debt, because when your money comes into your bank account and it already has somebody else's name on it, there's nothing you can do. You are not in control at that point in time, and we're really not in control ever anyway. When you hand control your finances over to God, that's the true freedom right there. So that was several years ago, and I can stand here today and tell you that my husband and I, through God's grace, have paid off over $100,000 in debt. Of that list, that original list of 38 creditors, we are on the last one. Amen. And I hope to have that one done by the time we do FPU here. And during that time frame of paying off debt, God made it possible for me to go back to school, to get my nursing degree, and pay for it 100% out of pocket. When you put God in control of your finances, He is in control. There were times where we were trying to pay off our debt and we had no money, and God literally had a check in the mailbox for us that day when we needed it. There were days where money showed up in our bank account, and I, to this day, can't tell you where it came from because I detail our stuff out to the penny. And there were days where, I remember one day where we didn't have any money, we had paid the bills, and I had nothing to send with my husband for lunch for work. I had nothing, we had no money, and I got a certificate that day for my birthday to go get free lunch downstairs in the cafeteria, and my birthday was 3 weeks away. So God provides the day you need it, the time you need it, not before, not later, but right when you need it. And it's important to me to share this, because I can tell you right now that there are people listening to this that are in the same scenario, or a similar scenario, or who have gone through it, and we don't want to share. It is embarrassing. We're adults. We're supposed to be in charge of our stuff. We're supposed to, we have jobs. We're supposed to be able to handle all of it, but there are times where we do get out of control, and some things happen, and we need to be able to share these things. It's important to know that you have other people you can lean on, and they might not be able to help you financially, but maybe we can point you in a direction where we can help you get back in control and get back to a place of true freedom, because when you don't have that debt, you are now free to help others. Imagine what our church would be like if all of us were completely 100% out of debt and we could truly help others with what we had and the impact we could have in our community. So I'm not standing up here to tell you guys this stuff to say, hoorah, yay, Alan Christie, you did such a great job. I'm sharing because the reason we were able to have these successes is because God blessed us. We didn't do any of this. God helped us through every step of the way, and God's what helped us get every debt paid off. So as we go forward, we're going to be starting that class here in April. April 6th is when we're going to start, so it's still a couple months away. But I'm going to be sharing some of this information to ramp up to start it, and I'm going to be asking some of you to help me with the class. I've already had one person who said they'd be willing to help. Some of you who don't know me are going to get an email from me this week asking if you wouldn't mind helping out with the class, because this is something that I truly believe in, and I truly think it's a true testament of faith to be able to have God in control of your finances. Because in church we'll talk about anything, but don't talk to me about my money. And I really think that needs to change. So, thank you for listening to my story. And thanks for letting me share.
That's encouraging, isn't it? I have a lot of respect for someone and family to share their story because, again, God knows who we are, and when we share who we really are and the journey we've been on, He uses that in a powerful way. And as Christy mentioned, this is not just about her sharing their story, but it's about us, our congregation, and this community as a story. So the timing of this that you see, April 6th, this is going to take place right after we finish our outreach series at the Ice Center, which is March 25 through April 1. So this is going to be an invitation for our congregation, as well as your friends, neighbors. This is posted on a national website that many people who are in similar situations that are looking just for this type of thing can go there and find it. So there's going to be a big invitation to this. Thursday nights here, and there are videos that are shown, there's discussion, but you get a kit that takes you through step by step. So I want to encourage us to be open to that, right? And lots of times it's not about the right knowledge, it's about the right behavior. But being willing to say, I want to participate with this. I want to continue to grow. So thank you for sharing your story and the challenge that we have to experience freedom as we embrace the right limitations that Jesus has given to us.